Fresh Cream. When beat gave way to psychedelia. How Cream changed 1960s music. As Paul McCartney observed, it was a tonal shift from the boy-girl thing to an important spiritual message. How did Cream form? In the late spring of 1966, after a Bluesbreakers gig, Ginger Baker gave Eric Clapton a lift back to London and suggested they form a band, a new kind of band made up of the best musicians on their instruments. Looking at the road ahead, Eric agreed. He smiled and said, "We better get Jack Bruce on bass then." Ginger's look spoke volumes, but he agreed to contact Jack. That was the start of Cream, the first rock supergroup. But in truth, this group was not what it seemed. They weren't close friends. Ginger and Jack were famous for being at each other's throats when in the Graham Bond organisation. Eric was unaware of this. Cream wasn't just a band belonging to the rock medium. "I thought of Cream as a sort of a jazz band," Jack Bruce said, "only we never told Eric he was really Ornette Coleman." That from Rolling Stone on the 9th of December 2016. Eric Clapton had left the Yardbirds because he thought them too pop-orientated and wanted to pursue the blues. As for Baker, he remarked, "I'd rather play jazz. I hate rock and roll." That again from Rolling Stone. Was Cream a pop band or an experimental rock group? Compromise was a trait that neither of the three bandmates showed any discernible interest in. The music on Fresh Cream is uncompromising and ambitious, as if they knew they had an opportunity to change pop music with whatever sound they came up with. Heavy metal thunder, some called it later on. The first thing they did was to decide to set up as a trio. That created a dynamic where each member was responsible for 1.5 instruments to make up for the lack of a keyboard player, second guitarist, or harmonica specialist or backing singer. This looseness would undergird their mandate for improvisation. The result was a determination to sound bigger than the number of the members in the band. What the Beatles achieved with 4 and the Stones achieved with 5 plus sidemen, Cream managed on Fresh Cream with just 3 musicians. Ginger Baker sought drum sounds outside of the European tradition. Clapton, unconfident in his voice, made his guitar sing, and Jack Bruce could play any style possible. He was funky, he was melodic, and he could play the bass as a lead instrument whenever Eric Clapton broke a string. How do you define the indefinable? That was one of the wonders of Cream. The band radically reinterpreted the function of each instrument in popular music. Their debut single could be described as 1920s theatrical doo-wop. That gives a sense of how difficult it is to categorize their style and sound. What were the band's earliest performances like before they started recording? Loud. Everyone agrees on that. Most of their early material was blues-based, but with arrangements similar to a Miles Davis quintet. From the start, Clapton was the instrumental focus. Any doubts about the Cream's ability to perform as a group and not 3-star soloists was dispelled by their sensational set. Melody Maker opined in a brow-wiping review following an early gig at London's Klux Clique on the 15th of November 1966. Clapton's style was noticeably different than on Mayall's Bluesbreakers album. Gone were the discrete controlled blues phrases replaced by a continuous stream of guitar vocalizations, avant-garde violin-like legato phrases deeply inspired by Ustad Bismillah Khan's Shania techniques, and to my ears, Eleanor Rigby, which came out in June 1966, about the time Cream was forming. I've always harboured a theory that the Beatles and Eleanor Rigby specifically had a profound impact on Clapton's approach after the Bluesbreakers. How would I describe Fresh Cream to someone who's never heard it? There's a lightness, an abandon almost, about the sound of this album. It was recorded before the band started thinking about playing this music to an audience with expectations. Without critics branding the music heavy, it was simply cosmic, joyful music. This is music of the senses. Whether awake in nature, hurtling on a train, or escaping in your dreams, it spans from horizon to horizon, except when it's got you by the throat like on Spoonful, a brooding and menacing ode to what is worst in us, that tightness in the guts and the lump in the throat before we show our very worst side. The album's sound rejects the austerity of the wartime generation and celebrates the hippie embrace of hopefulness in people and possibility. In 1966, the world seemed destined for better than its recent past, and Cream built its riffs and melodies from the ruins of this past and the uncompromising visions of artists like themselves. It's no surprise that their first real single was titled I Feel Free. Not only were Jack, Ginger and Eric free of their former bands and doing their own thing, but with popular music bounding in 1,000 different directions in 1966, they could afford to experiment with the styles that were most natural to them. This was the age of bands using the canvas of a whole album to create sonic masterpieces, unheard of before in the silliest of genres, pop music. In contrast, Ahmet Erdogan thought the sound on Fresh Cream to be too restrained. Obviously, I disagree. Pushing against boundaries suited the band members. Clapton had refused to turn down his amp when recording the Blues Breakers album, and Jack and Ginger had refused to get along in the Graham Bond organisation, the matter eventually being settled at knife point with Ginger driving Jack out of the band. Initially, the trio weren't after a commercial sound. They wanted to emphasise their instrumental interplay at ear-splitting decibel levels. British studios simply couldn't cope with the volume. With overdubs, this led to the tracks being mixed down into a murky soup. Stylistically, this would be considered innovative later on and copied by punk and alt-rock bands in the 70s and 90s. Cream's singles weren't the point of their existence. It was their non-singles that were more exciting. That is not to say I Feel Free, Sunshine of Your Love, White Room and Badge were not outlandishly great singles. What is the Cream conundrum? Whatever rock and roll had been up to and until that point in 1966, Cream's approach was different. Lots of bands worked very hard to show their wares as a collective. Cream had no problem with throwing a spotlight on one of their specialist instrumentalists. This was highly unusual at this point. It spoke of the confidence they had in each other and their work that they had no doubts that listeners' interest would be held by a drum or guitar solo or an extended choral introduction that was separate from the song. Eric, Jack and Ginger were a trio of soloists who worked collaboratively. Cream were not a blues or an art jazz band. The members hated rock and roll, but created some of the greatest pop music of the era. Some of their famous songs were written together with beat performance poet Pete Brown. Cream was truly the avant-garde. Would bands like the Stones have created distinctly long intros for songs like Sympathy for the Devil and Gimme Shelter without Cream's pioneering efforts on Fresh Cream? Would the Beatles have recorded While My Guitar Gently Weeps, a song so epic it threatened to eclipse Lennon and McCartney's efforts on the White Album without Harrison's friendship with Clapton? Maybe, but who knows? In the mid-60s swinging London scene, everyone was listening to everybody else's latest release, expecting to hear something new. So fast-moving was the pace of innovation in pop music at the time. How would I summarise the music on Fresh Cream? Blues rock with an uplifting sense. Key tracks. Wrapping Paper was a completely weird pop song as their debut single before Fresh Cream was released. Clapton hinted they had wanted to catch their expected audience off guard with a single that had nothing to do with the blues. I Feel Free, their real first single, was innovative, bringing together the vocal styles of soul/R&B groups and European choral monastic traditions with an explosively loud blues sound. The track starts with the choral sound of Jack, Eric and Ginger weaving their melody and harmonies around each other. You can hear the influence of George Harrison's Love You Too in the extended choral introduction to the song, a trick they would repeat to greater effect on White Room. Given the amount of musical information that's been packed into these 2 minutes and 55 seconds, it's a wonder the thing doesn't implode under the weight of its own inventiveness. So says the BBC's Sid Smith in 2007. On 4 Until Late, Clapton carries on his homage to his hero Robert Johnson. But having covered Rambling on My Mind on the Blues Breakers album, here he covers what might almost be deemed as filler from Johnson's catalogue. The recording is light fare, with Jack Bruce tooting on a harmonica to back Clapton's pleasant but unconvincing singing. This is not necessarily a criticism of the performance, but rather questioning why the band was so determined to confound their critics and their audience. Rolling and Tumbling and I'm So Glad. Covering Muddy Waters' barnstorming reinvention of the Delta blues standard makes total sense in the context of the trio format. It's a real showpiece for Jack Bruce's singing and harmonica playing. It hints at what Cream would unleash live on stage. I'm So Sad. Skip James' impertinent blues gambles along with Bruce's fierce singing, giving the lyrics bite atop a bed of dreamy vocal harmonies. Clapton's solo, mostly played on one string, pays its debt to modal music, be it Indian ragga or jazz. The deftness of Cream's cover can be favourably compared to the ham-fisted covers that followed by heavy metal bands. NSU is as close to rock and roll as Cream ever got. Ginger Baker's tribal drumming kicks the track off, hailing Clapton's prickly guitar to enter. The trio wail where you'd normally expect the chorus. The guitar solo is incisive, lyrical, and on the edge of being out of control. An overly frisky ode to a venereal disease. Spoonful is where Cream took flight as a live proposition. The playing soars above the instrumental limitations of most charting groups. It's a virtuosic performance that highlights each band member's talents. Greater than the sum of its parts, it has a majestic grandeur and horror about it. The performance can be seen as Cream's mission statement. However, the hubris it would engender in the band would bring them crashing down less than 2.5 years later. Everything's fighting about the spoonful, indeed. That was Fresh Cream, When Beat Gave Way to Psychedelia, How Cream Changed 1960s Music, by RolloGuitar, published by RJ Tosha on Patreon.